Hola a todos, soy Bianca Toilier, profesora de Teoría de la Educación en la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, y hoy estoy aquí en Radio UNED con el profesor Joris Vlieghe de la Universidad Católica de Lovaina en Bélgica, y vamos a mantener una conversación sobre una serie de trabajos que se vienen desarrollando desde el año 2016-2017 bajo la etiqueta de Pedagogía postcrítica. Quería también dar las gracias al profesor Juan García, profesor del Departamento de Teoría e Historia de la Educación de la UNED, que es quien ha hecho posible también que estemos hoy aquí con todos ustedes. La conversación va a ser en inglés, así que ahora cambiaré a este otro idioma. So, Joris, welcome. Thank you for being here and for agreeing to have this conversation that will be recorded and available for more people to listen to, hopefully. So the topic that we will talk about is, of course, post-critical pedagogy, and maybe we could start by the beginning. So kind of how you came up, you, Piotr, Zamojski, and Naomi Hodgson, so like the intra-story of how this came to fruition and became a manifesto.
I always start by saying that the three authors you mentioned are not the inventors of post-critical pedagogy. It's more like something was going on in the world of pedagogy or education studies. Many people had a profound discontent with a dominant paradigm, which we identified as a critical paradigm, hence a plea for a post-critical pedagogy. I know that this term has caused a lot of confusion because it seems like we are completely opposed to critical pedagogy. That's not at the heart of what post-critical pedagogy is all about. The idea is to do something differently from what was and still is mainstream in educational studies. Another name we sometimes use is affirmative pedagogy. So as to try and indicate that it is something that exists next to critical pedagogy without denying the great value of the critical paradigm.
Mm-hmm. But how did it happen? So I want to know, because this I don't know. How did you come to actually write it down, like the manifesto? Were you having a coffee and you came up with the idea? Did you write it online? Were you in the same room? How, like the inner story of the production of the manifesto?
Well, by happenstance, the three authors were working at the same university, so Liverpool Hope University. And we were working there as philosophers of education. And that is quite seldom, that you have three philosophers of education working at the same university. And in the conversation with the head of the department, it came up that we could somehow have a look what binds us together. Is there something typical of these three people working at the same place? And we had a brainstorm about it. I don't remember whether it was over a coffee or a beer. So unfortunately, those details, I don't remember them. But I believe it was Piotr who, a few years before that, wrote a paper in which he coined the term of post-critical pedagogy. Mm-hmm. And we came to the conclusion that this would actually be a very good term to describe what was at the heart of our own ideas about education.
In other occasions, you refer to this kind of general malaise that mm-hmm. would be that you've perceived there was in some educational researchers. What do you think causes this kind of malaise out of the mainstream critical paradigm? So why is it unsatisfactory at some point, and why is it kind of run out of steam? So what do you think?
Well, you refer to the famous expression by Bruno Latour,
mm-hmm.
the critical paradigm has run out of steam. It actually dovetails with the analysis that, the broader cultural analysis that Latour makes of Western intellectual history as from modern times, let's say 17th century on, thinking in the West is dominated by a logic of mistrust or distrust. We never take things at face value, especially if they are well-meant initiatives. The serious business of academic studies is going beyond the surface to debunk things and look for what is behind. And so that's a kind of general way of thinking that you can pursue and keep pursuing, but it's not really productive in the sense that it is not adding something to reality. It's stripping something from reality by laying bare some kind of structural or symbolic violence behind or educational systems and practices.
Mm-hmm. Could you explain also, like before we delve into the actual principles of the Manifesto, you point and recognize Hannah Arendt as your champion philosopher to present this proposal. So can you please explain what aspects of her thinking have been of more use for you to develop the Manifesto?
Mm-hmm. I think that Arendt would agree with what I just said about a logic of mistrust being dominant in Western thought and Western educational thought. But more to the point, she would probably make or add to this analysis that this critical paradigm is actually a political project. And central in Arendt's thinking is the neat opposition, the separation between the sphere of education and the sphere of politics. They are two different things. What happens in the critical paradigm is that education is understood as having a political goal. Existing, to put it very shortly, the existing educational provisions have to be debunked as serving the wrong political goals. And so we have to constantly reform education in order to realize the political goal of more equality, less violence, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. So the Manifesto itself has 5 principles. I don't know if you want to go through all of them, or maybe there is some kind of way of point to the common brand that make them come together. Mm-hmm. So what is the proposal about? What is the post-critical pedagogy propose?
Mm-hmm. So maybe I can start with the second principle, mm-hmm. which has to do with pedagogical hermeneutics. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that is dominating the discourse today is the conviction that we all perceive the world in a different way due to the position we have. You're a woman, therefore you see the world differently than I do because I'm male, mm-hmm. right? That's an obvious truth, and I'm not going to deny it. But the problem is that once you start playing this hermeneutical game, you can add perspective upon perspective, and you end up with the idea that everybody has a different view of the world. And if you then make education subservient to the political goal of justice, then the only goal we can have in mind is make sure that everybody can express his or her or their most private account of the world. Mm-hmm. To make it very concrete, yes. In an art class, well, you just look at the work of art and everybody says what he or she or they thinks. You no longer study the painting or the sculpture or whatever it is that is the object of study. The challenge of post-critical pedagogy, the very Arendtian challenge of post-critical pedagogy, is to ensure that our attention is brought back to a thing that we can have in common. In this case, the painting or the sculpture. The basic gesture of the educator, Arendt says, is, look, this is our world. So the idea is that in spite of the fact that obviously everyone has a different view of the world, the goal of teaching is to make sure that, so in spite of all these differences, we can become attentive for one and the same world. So the problem with this hermeneutical temptation is that it is actually world-destroying, in the sense that everybody is locked up in his or her or their private world. The challenge of post-critical education, so to speak, is to ensure that we actually live in one and the same world, that there's a possibility to live in one and the same world. And further to that, Arendt says, the essence of education, in her text, The Crisis of Education, she speaks about the essence of education. For her, the essence of education is love for the world. So the way in which the attention of our students can be focused on one and the same world happens when a teacher is able to convey love for the world, love for particular subject matter, in this case, love for works of art, painting, and so on.
Because you refer here, going through the example you made, how would it be to study something post-critically? Or how would be a teaching situation presented in a post-critical way, like think-centered study practices. But if we go to research practices, if we take research practices as on another area where post-criticality has something to do, how would it look like? So let's take, for example, playground observation. An ethnographic study, someone goes to the playground and to conduct an ethnographic study, how the children play or whatever is happening there. So what a typical, I know we are maybe making a little bit of caricature of both, but in order for understanding easily, what a typical critical researcher would do and what a typical or potential typical post-critical researcher would do in the same, given the same researcher field.
Well, probably critical perspective would start from the assumption that whatever happens on the playground will be somehow or will testify somehow to forms of structural and symbolic violence. And obviously, I'm not critiquing critique here. That can be a valid way of looking at things. But the problem is that you will probably come up with seeing what you already knew, right? What is a very famous school of thought within what we call the critical paradigm is, of course, the work of Bourdieu and Passeron, which shows that things that we take for granted, like the way in which we speak, the way in which we behave, also children vis-à-vis one another on the playground, is linked to social stratification, but we don't realize it. And therefore, we have to show it. We have to unearth it. In the hope that when we realize that, we will be able to create a society, or in this case, a school and a playground in the school, in which there will be more equality. This was thought of in the 70s. Numerous reforms have been introduced since then, only to come again and again to the same observation that there is always inequality. So again, I'm not holding a plea here against this type of research. The only thing is that it's probably not the most productive. A post-critical way of looking at what happens at the playground is probably taking the things that happen there at face value. So when children play together at the playground, the first reflex is not to think about what's behind it. We do not take them seriously. What they say is not correct. No, we really assume that when they say that, so that the meanings that they ascribe to what's happening there actually matters. Mm-hmm. So it's not starting from a kind of suspicious attitude, but from an affirmative attitude. And then maybe we can see things that we didn't see before.
Okay.
I can give actually a nice example.
Please.
Because we once collaborated with the Peace Institute in Flanders. There was a project about violence in vocational schools. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Peace Institute was very concerned about this. So we were involved in this project, and students from my university did interviews with the pupils who indeed behaved, in a sense, rather violently on the playground and in the halls in the school. But out of these interviews, it appeared that these pupils were very well aware of the fact that their form of life was quite violent, that sometimes they went too far and that sometimes led to problems, but at the same time they were very well aware of this. So it was not that somebody had to tell them that they were too violent. And this violent behavior vis-à-vis one another also had a meaning for them. So they could talk about it in ways that, yeah, okay, it's not. So again, with Bourdieu, this is not my habitus because I didn't study vocational education. From my perspective, violence is per definition a problem, but out of these interviews, it appeared that violence was for them a way of living and behaving to one another, which they didn't find problematic themselves to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. Okay, when these interviews were then sent to the Peace Institute, they were horrified because we hadn't done what they wanted us to do, namely to identify the problem. And in the end, you might believe it or not, we ended up by having a big discussion with Peace Institute. So it was not the collaboration with the Peace Institute ended not peacefully.
Yeah, it didn't end very well because you didn't confirm their views on how violence, this particular example. Thank you for sharing that. This come also, and probably what happened to you in this with the research institute reinforces the problem of keeping political and educative, like this strong difference between different camps. And it is interesting because in a way this is very central to the proposal, very nuclear, I find, very enlightening in many ways. But it is also the main critique. It's also the main issue that people raise. Like, well, actually, all educational is political. How can you be proposing like we depolitize education as a way of making, if you are invested in making the world a better place, how can you not try make a difference through education? So how do you address this, which I think is like the main kind of critique you get? Mm-hmm. You and everybody doing research under this paradigm, of course, or framework.
Yes.
Yeah.
I might start by saying that education is unavoidably political, as if just as that everything is political doesn't add anything. This is just stating the obvious. It's a tautology, right? I find it much more interesting to look for what sets education and politics apart, right? And one of the things that Piotr and I developed in later work, post-critical work on teaching, is that the sphere of politics and the sphere of education have their own logics. And these logics shouldn't be confused. So obviously politics can take over the sphere of education, but then it prevents education from running according to its own logics. So the logic of education is, as I already mentioned, sharing love for the world, love for things in the world. You cannot teach what you don't love. If you hate something, you can still, for instance, informatics, but you're not particularly interested in it. You can still instruct someone to work with software, but we don't call this educating or teaching, right? So teaching always has to do with being in love with a particular thing in the world, mathematics, cooking, music, history, you name it, and trying to show to the new generation that these things are important and why they are important. So it's a pure affirmative relation to the world, which stands opposed to the sphere of politics, which runs according to a logic of hate for the world. Hate for the world meaning that there is something wrong in the world, very much wrong in the world, and we have to put all our effort and attention in solving this problem. As long as this problem isn't solved, we cannot do anything else. So these are two different things. So hate is a relation to the world which is narrowing down and which has to do with setting straight something that we find problematic in the world. Whereas love for the world is an opening up to the world, potentially ad infinitum. And it has to do with being attentive for something, caring for something, and therefore wanting to study it, to know everything about it, to discover that there is always more to know about it, and so on. And of course, if you put study at work to reach a political goal, study is no longer pure. It's no longer out of love for things.
Yes, thank you. We are nearly out of time, but I want to bring a last question, considering we are in the National Open University. So if we go back to what a post-critical teaching practice would be and will mean for the world, and how relevant it is to show your love for the world, do you think it's possible to practice that, to do that from a university like this one, where there are constraints, very logistical ones, the fact that you don't see your students, but maybe you create radio programs like this one, or materials, or videos, or you write something to them. I don't know. So, and also the idea that it's distance education, so it's not just digital. Digital is one of the means they can use. But it's more the idea of distance education being... so I don't know, like what do you think about that? Because I know your ideas about the difficulties of doing that by digital means, but is it possible to still show and point to things when conditions are like the ones we're in, like there are no students, there will be maybe some listening to this?
Of course, who am I to say that it would be impossible under digital conditions of distance learning? The things that Piotr and I developed in our post-critical book on teaching were based on phenomenological study of what happens in face-to-face meetings in material schools. We have painted the portrait of a teacher, and if we put it next to what we saw happening in the corona pandemic, it was clear that at least Zoom education, which tries to replace real classroom teaching with a digital equivalent, that this kind of digitalization of education makes it very difficult to share love for the world with your students, because you don't, as a student, you don't really see the important gestures, which all come down to, look, this is our world. For instance, you don't see with what care a teacher, for instance, puts away a book in his or her bag. Does he or she, or they do it with care or without care? To give a very simple example. Of course, I don't know exactly how the Open University works, but I can imagine that people are inventive enough also to think of practices that are based on this conviction that education is at heart about sharing love for the world. But that would probably entail that teachers are heavily involved in thinking about the technologies we use in order to teach. So maybe the main lesson to take is that you should not leave the development of the technology of the Open University to experts in communication and then just ask teachers to work with it. You will have to, and probably that is the case, involve the teachers themselves in thinking about the technology, and then I'm convinced, and hopefully many with me, that just using Zoom technology is not a good way of teaching.
Okay, thank you. So I think we need to close it here. Thank you, Joris.
Thank you.
And we'll keep the conversation another day. Thank you.